Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allahumma lakal hamdu ala ni'amika al-azima wa alaika al-jasima. Lakal hamdu kama hadaytana ila al-Islam wa waffaqtana lis-salati was-siyami wal-qiyam. Wa nusalli wa nusallimu ala sayyidina Muhammad an-nabiy al-amin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa ahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. Ya Allah, teach us that which is beneficial for us and bless us in the knowledge you have granted us and increase our knowledge. My dear brothers and sisters, it's my pleasure once again to welcome you to another episode in our series of lessons on Islamic legal maxims and their applications. And this is the third episode. And in this one and the next one, I'm going to deal with one of the most important of this qawaid, this qaida or legal maxim. It is called al-umuru bi maqasidiha. This qaida, that al-umuru bi maqasidiha, all of the matters and affairs are reckoned or judged by their intentions. And I'm going to deal with this in two sessions, inshallah, this one and the next one, because this is a very, very important qaida applicable to many areas of fiqh. Of course, there are some exceptions. That's why I need to illustrate and explain and somewhat detail. Therefore, I need to take two sessions. So today we will talk about the meaning and definition and the sources of this qaida, the proof or evidence in the sources that this is an authentic qaida that has been traced to the sources, the Quran and the Sunnah, and of course then the applications of this qaida as expounded by our great scholars, inshallah. Coming to the meaning and definition, when you say al-umur bi maqasidiha, this is a compounded phrase made up of two words, al-umur and then al-maqasid. The word umur in Arabic is the plural of amr. Amr means command, a matter, a thing, or affair. Maqasid is the plural of maqsad, which means intent, motive, and purpose. And the phrase together, al-umur bi maqasidiha, means that matters, all matters, including statements that we make in the actions we perform, are reckoned and judged by reference to one's intentions while making a statement or carrying out an action. According to Imam Ibn al-Qayyim, rahimahullah, is a very important observation he made. The locus and niyyah mahalluha al-qalb. The place or the locus of the niyyah is the heart. He made this statement because many people have the misunderstanding that niyyah is uttering some statements, so that when they stand up for prayer, they say, Usalli, I intend to pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for rak'ah. Or intend to pray behind the imam. And they think that this is the niyyah. Actually, this is wrong. It's a misconception, because the real niyyah is, its place is the heart. So regardless whether you utter these words or not, if you don't formulate this niyyah in your heart, it's not valid niyyah. So niyyah is the mental deliberation prior to that, and not merely words. So the niyyah must be formulated in one's heart prior to that for the act to be considered as valid and acceptable in the Sharia. This qaida, al-umur bi maqasidi, has been considered the foremost of the most important of the Al-Qawa al-Khams al-Kubra. It's a fundamental concept of the religious law in Islam. It influences the performance of acts and duties. It also covers legal actions such as purification, prayer, charity, sales, divorce, and transactions. According to Imam Shafi, rahmahullah, the niyyah applies to 70 branches of jurisprudence, 70 departments, 70 areas. Niyyah serves dual roles in Islam. It has a moral dimension, it has a legal dimension. The moral dimension of the niyyah refers to the inner motive for one's actions. It's a very, very important thing. In order for our act to be moral, to be considered virtuous, we need to check the motive, the intention. By virtue of the intention, actions are either accepted or rejected by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As for the legal dimension of the niyyah, it refers to one's presence or absence of mental deliberation. This applies to many of the, especially the punishments for various crimes and things like that. So it's very important that legal dimension of the niyyah is whether we had the presence of mind, or we were in a sober state, etc. A person is charged because of this. A legal aspect of the niyyah is very, very important, because a person can be charged with an act or discharged from the duty based on the presence or absence of the niyyah. Likewise, the validity as well as the invalidity of actions are many times dependent on the niyyah. And as we said, punishment for crimes, for instance, the murder committed through deliberate intention and planning prior to the act is the gravest and most heinous crime, and of course execution, which entails execution. Whereas something by accident, you were driving a car and by accident you hit a person and killed him, the punishment for that is of a lower degree. It is not the same degree of crime or offense. As for the rewards in the afterlife, they vary according to the ranks of the actions. A farad, if you do an act which is an obligation, and with the niyyah obligatory act, the reward is different as for the reward of an action that is considered sunnah, and you did it with that niyyah, the reward is different. So anyway, so niyyah also affects the rewards in the afterlife, and also levels of rewards, degrees of rewards according to the niyyah. One of the greatest things in Islam is shahada, martyrdom, especially in a just cause, just war. Of course, this is we have to distance ourselves from the acts of terrorism. That cannot be considered jihad. Jihad is one we are called to take up arms by a valid Khalifa who is chosen by the Muslim Ummah. If he orders us to take up arms in defense, not in aggression, then it is our duty to respond. And if in the course of that struggle we achieve martyrdom, reward is dependent on the niyyah. If the niyyah was to raise the word and to take up, because Allah wants us to stand for justice and truth, and this was the niyyah, then the reward, person is rewarded. The greatest reward of a martyr is the greatest status. If, however, during the course of the struggle, he entered the struggle and this war with the intention of fame and glory or beauty, then of course he is denied the rewards. Now, the next point that we need to consider is, where did they derive this qaida or the legal maxim? Because this is one of the greatest of the 5 al-qawaid al-khams, the 5 grand legal maxims. Why it's considered one of the greatest? Because it is grounded in the sources. It's clearly based on the explicit evidence of the sources, and of course, sources in Islam, authentic sources are the Quran and the Sunnah. A direct source of this is the Hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. إنما الأعمال بالنيات وإنما لكل امرئ ما نوى فمن كانت هجرته إلى دنيا يصيبها أو إلى امرأة ينكحها فهجرته إلى ما هاجر إليه. Actions are judged by their intentions, and everyone is rewarded according to his intention or her intention. So if someone emigrates for some worldly gain or marrying a woman, that will be his share or her share of the hijrah. In other words, he is not considered a muhajir who has undertaken the hijrah for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, the hadith, it's a very important thing for us to understand that the hadith itself is a tafsir of the Quran. So we cannot deny the status of hadith. Prophet is the mufassir par excellence of the Quran, the interpreter par excellence of the Quran. So the Prophet has based this statement on numerous verses in the Quran that clearly state the critical role or the status of a niyyah or intention. To cite a few verses, very important for us to understand this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah 98, verse 5, وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ حُنَفَاءَ. They are commanded only to worship Allah in sincere devotion. So sincerity of intention and being upright, steadfast, without straying away to the right or left, straight path, upright path. Another in Surah 4, verse 100, this is part of that verse where Allah speaks of hijrah. Directly we can say here, our Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has derived that statement, inferred his understanding from the direct verse of the Quran. وَمَنْ يَخْرُجُ مِنْ بَيْتِهِ مُهَاجِرًا إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ ثُمَّ يُدْرِكْهُ الْمَوْتُ فَقَدْ وَقَعَ أَجْرُهُ عَلَى اللَّهِ وَكَانَ اللَّهُ غَفُورًا رَحِيمًا. Those who leave their homes and die while emigrating to Allah and His Messenger, the reward has already been secured with Allah, and Allah is all forgiving, most merciful. Another verse, Surah 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 225. لا يؤاخذكم الله باللغو في أيمانكم ولكن يؤاخذكم بما كسبت قلوبكم والله غفور حليم. Allah will not hold you accountable for unintentional oaths that you made, but for what you intended in your hearts. And Allah is all forgiving, most forbearing. Hence, the acts of worship are rendered valid or invalid according to the niyyah. Moreover, based on one's niyyah, a single act, outwardly it is the same act, but because the niyyah is different, how an act can be considered an act of worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or it can be an opposite, an act of shirk. The cardinal sin in Islam, this is the first of the major sins in Islam, is associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Take for example, somebody prostrates to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, make that sujood in reverence to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is an act of worship. But on the other hand, if we make prostration before a human being or before an idol or before an animal out of reverence, that act is considered shirk, a cardinal sin, unforgivable sin. Hence, the niyyah is the one that distinguishes acts of worship from habits. Very, very important for us, including ghusl, wudu. Ghusl can be a habit. People purify, bathe, just to get rid of dust and dirt and filth, najasa. Or it can be an act of worship if you are doing this to free yourself from that spiritual defilement. Because of sexual defilement, you have intercourse with your wife, or menstruation, you free from menstruation, after expiry of menstruation, or after expiry of postnatal bleeding, one is making that ghusl with the intention of becoming eligible, making oneself eligible for salah, or tawaf, or reading the Quran. So that's an act of worship. Likewise, fasting. People fast because they want to have a lean body, a diet program. They are following a diet program, a regimen to get rid of the excessive weight. The niyyah is not to observe this act of worship, so it's not considered a ibadah. Like it was charity given for fame, as opposed to charity given for the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of these acts that we perform can be merely worldly acts or acts of worship, depending on the niyyah. Likewise, based on the niyyah, a single act can fall in one of three categories. It can be wajib, or makruh, or haram. An example is, if a person marries a woman to remain chaste because he fears that if he doesn't get married, he may fall into adultery or fornication. So he is doing so to keep himself chaste and guard against sins, then it may be obligatory in this case for him. If that is the only way for him to remain chaste, it's obligatory for him to get married. If, however, a man in the main purpose for marrying a woman is because she is wealthy, she is rich, or she comes from a high family, a family of high status, then that marriage may be undesirable, makruh. If, on the other hand, a man marries a woman not to have, lawful union with her, a loving relationship, but simply to harm her, to torture her, to make her a prisoner, so that she is not free, na'udhu billah, then it is considered haram. So how a single act can either fall into one of these categories? It can be wajib, it can be makruh, or it can be haram, and they even include another category, sunnah, highly recommended. It would be the case if somebody cannot. There is no need. He can protect himself even without marriage, but he wants to do so to follow the beautiful example of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and also to establish, lay foundation for a happy family. In that case, it becomes a sunnah for him, and of course rewarded if the niyyah is there. The role of niyyah in ibadat are critical, integral, so it does not have the same status, but at the same time, niyyah doesn't have the same status or same degree of consideration in certain contracts that affects the rights of others. But before understanding this concept, we need to know still an element of niyyah or mental deliberation has to be there. In Sharia, taklif or legal accountability, liability for one's actions is based on a person being in a sober state of being, or otherwise in full possession of his senses. There is no taklif on somebody who is unconscious, or he is not in possession of his mind. a person who is insane, mentally challenged, a person who is not in a sober state. There is no accountability. So of course, so actions in duress. If somebody has been forced to get married, if you force a woman to get married, that marriage is not valid. So if you force somebody to engage in a contract, to enter into a contract, that contract is invalid. So that's why marriage or contracts made in duress are considered invalid. However, we need to make an exception here, clarification, that contracts that are concluded clearly in words, articulated in words or in writing, in a sober state of mind, and when a person is in full possession of his senses, are considered binding. A person cannot get away by saying, I didn't have that niyyah. No, you are bound by your contract, which you have made in a sober state of mind. Inshallah, I will conclude this session here, and we will follow it up in the next session. So I will continue the remaining in the next session, and the discussion is not complete without that other part. So bear with me as we continue the discussion in the next episode. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our work. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless us in striving to increase our knowledge for the enhanced understanding and practice of Islam. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.